In this lesson, we're going to look at sexual coercion or sexual victimization. And we're going to look at three main types, including child sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and sexual assault. This is a difficult topic for a lot of us, and undoubtedly, some of us in this class have or will have personal experience with this, or may know someone who has personal experience with this. The fact of the matter is, all of us are impacted to some degree simply by the existence of these things in our society. Pedophilia was mentioned under the atypical sexual behaviors or sexual variations category. Most atypical sexual behaviors don't have a victim. And of course, childhood sexual abuse absolutely is a crime with a victim, which really sets it apart from most sexual variations. In Canada, we have age of protection laws. It used to be called the age of consent. And this refers to the legal age at which a person is thought to be able to give consent to have sex. In Canada, that's 16 years. It is 18 years if the adult in the situation is in a position of authority or trust. So, for example, a teacher or a hockey coach or something to that effect. If the person has power or a position that sort of creates that imbalance, then the age of protection goes up to 18 rather than 16. There is a close-in age exemption there because the idea here is not to punish young people for having sex. It's to protect young people against adults who would take advantage of them or who would victimize them. And so if it's two young people who are having sex, then if they're within 2 years of each other, then that age of protection doesn't apply. So there are exceptions to that rule that basically allow young people to have sexual relationships without unduly punishing them. Childhood sexual abuse is not a rare phenomenon. In fact, according to one report, it's estimated that about 10% to 20% of females are victims of childhood sexual abuse, and about 5 to 15% of males. Most perpetrators, most abusers are male, although they're not exclusively male. Some females also are perpetrators of sexual abuse. Unfortunately, we don't have good data when it comes to something like childhood sexual abuse. In fact, one study reported that only about 20% of victimization was ever reported to authorities. Another problem is that when it is reported, many people don't believe it. For example, in Canada, there was a famous case of the Mount Cashel orphanage. This was a case where abuse was going on for many, many, many years, and even when it was reported, it was simply not believed, and it took many, many years before it came to light. With increased awareness, more cases are coming to light, and these attitudes that are dismissing of the possibility of child sexual abuse are becoming less of a problem. It's becoming more and more difficult simply to ignore the problem and say, oh no, this doesn't really happen. Another problem is that some people may not remember that they've been abused, especially if it's happened in early childhood. Some people would say, even if they were abused, they would say as adults that they never were because they literally don't remember it. In fact, it's fairly rare, but there are people who repress those memories. There are people who have been sexually abused as children and have literally no memory of that period of their life because it was such a traumatic time that they've simply repressed all those memories. Other people have simply chosen not to think about those things, not to not to rehash those traumatic or upsetting memories, and so as a result, they've simply suppressed those memories. They've been just pushed down to the point where they've long lost those memories, or they've long forgotten them. They're still in there and could be triggered, but through whatever mechanism, they quite simply don't remember having been abused. Now, sometimes there's sometimes controversy over this idea of recovering a memory later in life, and that's largely due to just there being many cases of false memories. And this used to be more of a problem in the past than it is today. But it was due largely to poorly skilled, unskilled therapists who would basically, for example, ask a child, oh, and did this particular thing happen? Sort of suggesting or planting the idea. Therapists, police officers, anyone who does interviews with potential victims of, say, of any type of assault or sexual abuse, they're much more likely nowadays to be skilled when it comes to asking questions such as, and what happened next, rather than did he touch you inappropriately. So those false memories, those false reports are largely the result of poorly skilled interviewers, which today is less of an issue, but certainly still a possibility. The fact of the matter is, research on recovered memory shows that it very much is a legitimate phenomenon. People can repress or suppress memories for a long time and then remember them much later in life. In fact, there's a lot of research today that shows that this is very much a real possibility. A pedophile is a person whose primary sexual interest is in children. That is, they are more attracted to children than they are to adults. They're usually not attracted to relatives. They usually are not, also they are not typically likely to abuse a child or actually act upon their fantasies. So pedophilia refers to attraction to children. In fact, a preference for children over adults. Um, there is no definite pattern or sort of set of characteristics for pedophiles. They tend to come from all backgrounds when it comes to things like education, intelligence, race, sexual orientation, and so on. But it does seem that there a large percentage or a large proportion appear to be relatively conservative. Well, firstly, the overwhelming majority of pedophiles are male. Um, they tend to be more conservative, more moralistic, sometimes with narrow religious views. Often they tend to be married but have poor social skills and may not relate well with adults, sexually or interpersonally. Now, most perpetrators of child sexual abuse are not pedophiles, given the definition just noted. That is, their primary interest is typically in adults, but they are also attracted to children. Abusers will often pattern their entire lives around having access to children. These may include, teachers, priests, child care workers, and sometimes they have dozens, even hundreds of victims. Um, they may not even see anything wrong with what they're doing. They may see it as expressing love and affection for a child. They may claim, for example, that the child seduced them, and of course, this is just another myth to support this type of behavior, but it is one um, that pervades. It's often cited that, oh, the child knew what he or she was doing, and that they were being seductive, which of course is not really possible for a young child to knowingly be engaging in that sort of thing. They also have this idea that the child is consenting, that this is legitimate behavior, that it's two people, which according to the legal definition is of course impossible. Um, these can be a difficult group to treat, often because they are mandated to treatment by the judicial system, and so they're not actually seeking help; they're being sent to help. Um, so there have been various treatments that have been proposed, and kind of like with a lot of things, cognitive behavioral therapy does stand out as the most effective means when it comes to treating childhood sexual abusers. Typical feature of cognitive behavioral therapy is cognitive restructuring. This involves identifying incorrect or dysfunctional thoughts and helping the person to replace those with more correct or adaptive thoughts. So one example would be this perception that the child is consenting and the child is, actually wants to engage in this behavior, or the belief that there's no other way for the person to have their sexual needs met than to, follow through on these urges. Masturbation reconditioning, in this case, may involve teaching the person to be aroused to adults rather than to fantasies of children. Um, Desensitization um, involves, well, for example, aversion therapy would be one type of desensitization. The idea there is to use behavioral techniques to reduce that positive response to a particular stimuli. In this case, say for example, child pornography or fantasies about having sex with children. And so aversion therapy may include, in this case, using a noxious or very unpleasant stimulus to recondition the person's response, say, to fantasies about sex with children. This could be a really bad smell or something that makes a person feel nauseated. It could also involve using that fantasy and just having that sexual fantasy just completely go south. So rather than the person who's fantasizing about having sex with a child and she's very willing and everything is happy and everyone's great, instead, as that fantasy proceeds, the person, instead of it ending on a happy note, instead of everything being pleasant, the story ends with the man's wife walking in on him and discovering him sexually assaulting a child, and then he looks and the child is crying, his wife is crying, the police come, etc., etc. So that aversion therapy could be to ruin the fantasy, it could be to ruin that sort of condition response sort of thing. All of this involves applying principles of behaviorism, hence that behavioral component of cognitive behavioral therapy. Another important aspect here is stress management, because often behaviors like this can be triggered by say for example stress in the person's life, and so dealing with some of those triggers, dealing with some of those circumstances, can be helpful to help the person to cope. Help the person to, to address those fantasies, or not to follow down that same path and to give in to those urges. We see, generally speaking, at least according to one report, a reduction of recidivism, that is repeat offending, of about 10% with these types of interventions. So not massively successful, but to some degree at least there's value here in helping people, helping therapists to, or rather therapists helping people, deal with this. When it comes to prevention programs to help children or families, unfortunately, these programs are usually directed at dealing with strangers. Despite the fact that we know that the most common occurrence involves someone that is known to the child and known to the family. Some good programs are out there that teach about things like good touches and bad touches, and they reinforce children for telling an adult if they're uncomfortable or if they've been abused. So it does help kids to disclose that abuse, but it doesn't serve to prevent that abuse from happening. To get prevention, we need to empower children. We need to tell them that they have rights and that their feelings and their beliefs have value. So good prevention programs would include things like good sex education, starting early and teaching children things that are appropriate for their age, for their understanding, and not simply just trying to terrify them of strangers, but to teach them the appropriate things that they need to know about sex education and things like that at a young age. Teaching children that they have rights, that to empower them to stand up for themselves if they feel uncomfortable. Teaching them that things like that bad touchers are never their fault. That's often a strategy that abusers will use, is to scare the child and say that it's their fault, and if they tell anyone, they're the one who's going to get in trouble. And so helping children to understand what this is and empower them to speak up for themselves. And to, if it does happen, empowering them to tell someone about it, sooner rather than later. exposing them to strategies that abusers might use or things that they might say can help them to, to deal with those situations. And of course, this all must be done in the context of positive sexuality. In the same way we teach children to be careful about crossing the street so they don't get hit by a car, we don't teach them to be terrified of cars, right? We teach them how to navigate their world. And that's an important component of preventing childhood sexual abuse. Our next topic is sexual harassment. And sexual harassment specifically refers to things like unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when submission is made a term or condition of an individual's employment or academic advancement. So the key ingredients here, the key aspects of this are that the sexual advances are unwelcome and that they are coercive. Typically, victims are female and harassers are male. However, men absolutely can be victims of both male and female harassers. However, men are far more likely to say that they found sexual overtures of a woman to be enjoyable rather than upsetting. Usually there's a power difference. Typically it's the case that the one conducting the harassment or committing the harassment is the one who has power over the other individual. So what are we talking about specifically? Well, we're talking about things like, making unwanted remarks, commenting on a person's appearance, commenting on their body, or making remarks, of a sexual nature, being denied advancement due to gender, um, keeping a job or a position by having sex with, with a superordinate, with a boss or supervisor, being sexually intimidated in a work environment, or rewards in a work environment that are based on gender or on sexual performance with a superior. These can happen in a work environment. They can happen at a university situation. Anytime there is an imbalance of power, and anytime that the person is subject to unwanted behavior or remarks, particularly if it's coercive with regard to their grades or their employment, then this is the definition of sexual harassment. The sad fact is that sexual harassment is far more common than most people realize. In fact, according to one study, about a third of all female students report having been sexually harassed at some point during their tenure as a student. In a workplace, half of women, according to one study, reported having been sexually harassed just in the past year, and three-quarters reported having been sexually harassed at work in their lifetime. Um, the vast majority of harassers are male, although women also can commit sexual harassment, but for the most part they tend to be males. And the targets or the victims of sexual harassment, for the most part, are female. Men are more likely to report that advances from women were reciprocal and enjoyable. They're less likely to perceive it or to experience it as upsetting or potentially damaging. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to report damaging consequences, including things like being fired or just quitting their job due to the stress and the coercive environment. There are a variety of theories that have been used and are used to study and to try to understand and explain sexual harassment. Sociocultural theory is based largely on the feminist perspective, and it suggests that gender inequality and sexism in society lead to sexual harassment. That is, sexual harassment occurs in various forms because of society's stereotypical view that males are dominant and superior to women. In turn, sexual harassment then contributes to maintaining gender stratification by highlighting sex role expectations. According to this theory, men and women are socialized to expect specific ways of interaction, with men as aggressive and dominant, and women as passive and accepting. According to organizational theory, sexual harassment occurs because of a wide range of organizational issues, such as power and status inequalities. Similar to sociocultural theory, the organizational theory suggests that power differentials within an organization influence the likelihood that sexual harassment will take place. The difference here is that the focus of power differentials is not gender specific. Sexual harassment, which can be perpetrated by males or females, is often seen as an attempt to gain power within an organization or to exert power. In addition to power differentials, organizational theory looks at other contributing factors of sexual harassment, including things like the permissiveness of the organizational climate, gendered occupations, and organizational norms or ethics. Whereas organizational theory helps to explain contextual factors for sexual harassment, it doesn't focus on the individuals in that environment and differences between individuals. On the other hand, sex role spillover theory attempts to integrate contextual characteristics, for example, the environment, and those individual gender-based beliefs. The foundation of this theory is that men and women have pre-existing beliefs and gender-based expectations for how to behave in various settings. Whether or not those beliefs and expectations are in fact applicable to a given setting. So, for example, a male harasser may believe that women shouldn't be in a position of managing other people, despite the organizational perspective that workers should be able to advance and be in leadership positions regardless of gender. As a result of this gap between the individual's belief and the organizational perspective, conflict is likely to arise in which the harasser's sex role stereotypes are different from those actual gender roles that play out in the organization. This might explain why some women in positions of power, not traditionally held by women, are likely to experience sexual harassment. So, for example, CEOs or high-ranking military officers, because they're violating, in the minds of harassers, they're violating those sex role expectations. The biological theory suggests that sexual harassment is an expression of sexual attraction. According to this theory, because men have a stronger innate drive to be sexually aggressive and find a mate compared with women, men who sexually harass women are simply using their power to try to maximize their chance of gaining sexual access and reproducing. And so, according to this perspective, sexual aggression may occur at work or in other inappropriate situations to increase these chances. Although this theory you know, uh, has a strength in that it acknowledges innate human instincts, it of course has a lot of weaknesses. For example, it treats sexual harassment in particular and sexual coercion in general in a very simplistic manner, with a lack of consideration of other individual or interpersonal factors. Um, Also, proving this theory is difficult, given that you can't really design any studies to test it. And it may be based on a fairly simple or oversimplified sort of understanding of evolutionary theory. So, if we take an example of sexual harassment, um, let's say Louis C.K., how can we apply those different theories or perspectives to try and understand this? Or which of these theories do you think might be most applicable to this case? So here's a short clip or a short sort of quote from a New York Times article in which several women were interviewed about Louis C.K.'s sexual harassment. It was something that I knew was wrong, said the woman, who described sitting in Louis C.K.'s office while he masturbated in his desk chair during a workday. Other colleagues just outside the door. I think the big piece of why I said yes was because of the culture, she continued. He abused his power. Now, this is a quote from Louis C.K. Immediately after in response to this. So he was, apologetic and contrite, and this is a part of what he stated. The power I had over these women is that they admired me. and I wielded that power irresponsibly. I also took advantage of the fact that I was widely admired in my and their community, which disabled them from sharing their story and brought hardship to them when they tried to, because people who look up to me didn't want to hear it. I didn't think that I was doing any of that because my position allowed me not to think about it. So, what do you think? Theories are attempts to explain phenomena. They are attempts to help us understand, particular phenomena. Not every theory is going to apply to every case, but to the extent that they do apply to cases, they can be helpful. They can be helpful for understanding particular incidents and also for guiding research. So, do you think that one of these theories is particularly applicable here? Sociocultural theory says that we're all socialized to think this way. Organizational theory looks at power differentials in an organizational environment. Sex role spillover theory looks at the mind of the harasser when their sex role expectations may be violated by, for example, by having a female boss. Biological theory says that there's an innate drive toward sexual aggression and sexual assertiveness, and that this can be expressed in a non-sexual environment, but in a sexual manner. Do you think that one or more of these theories is useful here in this particular case? How can we better understand this particular case, and many, many, many cases like this? So when it comes to preventing sexual harassment, there are a variety of strong recommendations here. Firstly, acknowledge that sexual harassment does happen. That it is not, it's not something you can just ignore or sweep under the rug, or refuse to acknowledge or believe. It happens, and it's all too common. Don't condone harassment when you see it happening. Don't condone harassment conducted by others. That includes things like, laughing at a sexist joke. Maybe on the inside you're thinking, wow, that's not cool. Yet on the outside, you show no indication of this. You're basically condoning that behavior if you do nothing about it. If you just nervously laugh at the joke or something. But even frankly, even just ignoring it technically is condoning it. If you're there and it happens and you say nothing and do nothing, well, that lack of action is to some degree condoning the behavior. So don't be complacent. Speak up and say something, and most likely anyone else who's there is probably feeling similarly. Take responsible action if you believe that harassment is taking place. Um, any work environment or school environment should have established procedures to deal with harassment. And so, rather than waiting until someone comes to a supervisor or a boss and then figuring out how are we going to deal with this, any work environment, and most likely today, any environment like that does have specific procedures in place so that no one has to ask, oh, what are we supposed to do here? Other than, to look it up and see what is the procedure, what is the policy. And those procedures include, whom do those reports go to, what steps need to be taken, and so on. Those procedures must protect both the accuser and the accused. That complaint should be made to someone outside of the chain of command, so there is no threat to that person, to the complainant, when they take action. And of course, there must be consequences for that harassment. And of course, that's an important part of those procedures, is there must be consequences, and those consequences must be applied when that is applicable. The Me Too movement has done a lot to bring sexual harassment and sexual assault to the forefront of our attention, making it possible for many victims to come forward knowing that they're not alone, and making it difficult or impossible for perpetrators to keep hiding in a system that often doesn't acknowledge these issues, and that often doesn't apply consequences for this type of behavior. third type of sexual victimization that we're going to talk about today is sexual assault. In Canada, prior to 1983, the legal definition of rape, according to the Criminal Code of Canada, was heterosexual intercourse by a man with a woman who is not his wife without her consent, or with forced or false consent. Uh, as you can probably see, there are a lot of problems, or there were a lot of problems with this definition. Firstly, it was limited to heterosexual intercourse. Um, it was also specifically the case that the assailant was male and the victim was female, according to the definition of rape. That is, women legally could not be charged with rape, and men legally could not be victims of rape. Also, husbands could not be charged with raping their wives because a woman could not legally refuse her husband's demands. Um, Beyond or in addition to all the problems with the legal definition of sexual assault, um, also when it comes to the actual legal system, the victim's past sexual activities could be considered as evidence of her consent and also could be used to challenge the credibility of her testimony. In other words, they were quite literally putting her past on trial and discussing, well, if you had sex with, a person you met at a club last month, then why should we believe that you weren't willing to have sex with this person that you just met on that particular date? Um, Also, when it came to the judicial system and legal proceedings, rape had to be corroborated by evidence, by physical evidence, or by a witness, which of course would rule out a lot of instances and make it impossible, to even charge a person with sexual assault. And complaints that were not made immediately, for the most part, would have been dismissed out of hand. And so, not surprisingly, the vast majority of complaints of rape did not ever result in a conviction. Fortunately, in 1983, the Criminal Code was amended so that the crimes of rape and indecent assault were replaced with three gender-neutral crimes of sexual assault. And the crimes depend on the amount of force used to carry out the assault and the degree of injury sustained by the victim. So we have three levels of sexual assault that parallel the three levels of physical assault, according to the Criminal Code. There is simple sexual assault. Um, this is the first level involving minor or no physical injuries to the victim. Um, in 2001, there were approximately 24,000 reported cases of sexual assault that fell into this category. According to the criminal code, the maximum sentence for this is up to 10 years in prison. There is the second level. Level 2 is assault with a weapon or threats. So using a weapon, using threats, or causing bodily harm. The maximum sentence there is up to 14 years. And in 2001, that same study, there were a little over 300 reported cases there. And then the third most extreme category is aggravated sexual assault, and that involves wounding, maiming, or disfiguring or endangering the life of the victim. And for this, a person can receive a sentence of up to life in prison. In the same study in 2001, there were approximately 170 cases. So, according to these numbers, those two most extreme levels are also the most rare type. Of the fewer than 25,000 cases in that year, approximately 5,000 of those went to court. So that's 1 in 5. And about 40% of those resulted in a conviction. So approximately 8% of reported cases resulted in an actual conviction. The purposes of this change in the legal definitions and in legal proceedings, there were a variety of purposes for this. Largely, it was to de-emphasize the sexual nature of the offenses, to stress the violent nature of the assaults, to encourage victims to report these crimes and to improve those court procedures. So today, at least it shouldn't be the case that a victim's past will be put on trial. The idea here is to improve that procedure to reduce trauma to victims and to increase the rate of convictions, to give the judicial system more power to actually convict those perpetrators. So the legal definition of sexual assault today is non-consensual oral, anal, or vaginal penetration obtained by force, by threat, or bodily harm, or when the victim is incapable of giving consent. So this includes a wide range of non-consensual sexual experiences, ranging from unwanted touching to forced intercourse and sexual violence causing injuries. It's a gender neutral definition. It allows for men to be victims of sexual assault, for women to be charged with sexual assault, and it doesn't discriminate against married people. So the key here is consent. Consent is something that must be actively established. Silence, inaction, or ambiguous conduct is not consent. It's something that is active and that can be given and can be withdrawn. Consent is not considered to be obtained if the person is unable to give consent, for example, because they're drunk or unconscious. It's also not considered to be obtained if the person consents and then changes his or her mind. And so we have a much better definition of sexual assault and a much better legal system, even if it isn't perfect. It certainly is a big improvement on what used to be the case. The term partner sexual assault has replaced the term marital sexual assault because not all spouses or long-term relationship partners are necessarily married. But this is what it refers to is the sexual assault of a person by his or her spouse or long-term relationship partner. According to Stats Canada, something like 8% of women, or approximately 1 in 12 women, report having been sexually assaulted by a current or former spouse. And there's typically an association between non-sexual violence and sexual violence in long-term relationships. In other words, a man who physically assaults his wife is often likely also to sexually assault her. In fact, one American study reported that about a quarter of women who reported being physically assaulted by their husbands, about a quarter of these women reported also being sexually assaulted. And about a third of these women reported being forced to have sex by their husband. Um, and so physical violence and sexual violence tend to go hand in hand. Often the response initially is anger. The victim's response typically is anger. However, they frequently begin to experience self-blame. People who are victims of assault generally are more likely to say that their marriages had been getting worse over time. And so, unfortunately, victims often tend to blame themselves because they're staying in the relationship, or because a fight, an argument turned into violence, and they feel like, oh well, if I just hadn't said or done that thing, then it wouldn't have happened. Which, of course, is an unreasonable way to look at it. But unfortunately, a lot of the times, victims will engage in self-blame. Date rape is also referred to as social rape or social sexual assault, simply because that social interaction isn't always specifically a date, but it refers to sexual assault by an acquaintance, a relationship partner, a dating partner, a friend, whatever the case may be, someone that the person has chosen to interact with and to be with socially. One national survey found that about a quarter of female university students had experienced sexual coercion in the past year. Not all of those cases would fit the legal definition of sexual assault, but they fall into that category of sexually coercive behavior. Sometimes victims don't recognize that what happened was, in fact, a sexual assault because it occurred in a dating situation, and because often it occurred after the couple had been engaging in some consensual sexual activity, and it progressed to a sexual assault. And so often it can go unreported because the person may not recognize it as an actual sexual assault. There are a variety of things that can facilitate or lead to social sexual assault or date rape. One common factor is miscommunication. This idea that no means yes. And that's not an attempt to let anyone off the hook, to say, oh, well, they just didn't realize. It's a very legitimate problem that impairs or hampers communication. And so this is often portrayed, this idea that no means yes. It's often portrayed in the movies. It's typically portrayed in pornography. If the woman starts off by saying no, pretty much every time she eventually is saying yes, and everyone's happy in the end, which is one of those myths that can be perpetrated by pornography that can contribute potentially, anywhere theoretically, can contribute to sexual assault. There are a variety of explanations for why sexually aggressive men often misperceive women's communications. Um, Key factor there, sexually aggressive men. In other words, not just, oh, they just didn't understand. Something about these men is impairing that understanding or that communication. So in some cases, men may lack competence. These sexually aggressive men specifically, they may lack competence in reading women's negative emotions. They may be unaware when a woman is expressing hesitation or nervousness or discomfort. Sexually aggressive men often fail to make subtle distinctions between a woman's friendliness and seductiveness. Men in general are more likely to misperceive friendliness as sexual interest compared to women. But when it comes to sexually aggressive men, they may be even more likely to see any smile or any friendly overture from a woman as a sign of her sexual interest in him. Um, Sexually aggressive men also tend to have a suspicious schema and automatically doubt that women are communicating truthfully or accurately, especially when a woman rejects a sexual advance. Um, they may simply see that as, oh, well, all women lie, or in this situation, all women say no just so they don't appear too easy. They will view her communications with suspicion and mistrust. Um, There are two main forms of ambiguous communication that are particularly related to sexual victimization. There's token resistance, that is saying no when in fact the person means yes, and there is compliance, which is saying yes when the person means no. And so it's incredibly important when it comes to communication that both parties are aware of the other's perspective and the other's thoughts, and that both parties are clear in their communication. Ambiguous communication where the person is maybe feeling one thing but they say another thing, or they're very, very tentative about what they're saying, often can facilitate or exacerbate that miscommunication. Another big issue when it comes to date rape is the existence of date rape drugs. So Rohypnol is the most commonly known example of this, but there are a variety of drugs out there that people can use to, for example, to make their victim feel drowsy and make it so that, well, in the case of Rohypnol, the person will feel very drowsy, they'll lose consciousness, and they won't remember a lot. The next day, they won't remember a lot of those events. And so, of course, every person has probably heard that advice of, don't accept drinks from strangers. If a person offers to buy you a drink at a bar, get it from the bartender. Don't just let a stranger hand you a drink and then put that in your body. In fact, this is such a common thing that some bars have coasters that have a chemical in them that will detect the presence of rohypnol in your drink. If you spill your drink on the coaster will, change color or something like that to indicate that, that drink has been spiked with a drug. Even if it is relatively rare that specific thing would happen, the fact is it's important to be conscious of that possibility and to be aware of those risks. When it comes to trying to understand the causes of sexual assault, there are four major theoretical views here. One of those is called the victim precipitated event. This is the idea that there's something about the victim that causes her to be a victim of sexual assault. That could be her wearing enticing clothing, walking alone late at night, going home with a man she just met. The idea here is that the victim is at fault for that crime. And it also assumes that men are just animals and that they're incapable of controlling their sexual expression, that women are the ones who are supposed to be responsible and supposed to be on guard. There are no data to show that any specific characteristics of women correlate with a likelihood of being raped. Whether it's her personality, the way she dresses, the way she acts, there's nothing associated with being a victim of sexual assault. However, there are rape myths that just don't seem to die. Rape myths include things like no really means yes, all women really want, deep down want to be forced to have sex, or things like, oh, what did she expect being dressed like that? The obvious extension, of course, is that a man dressed in a business suit is just asking to be mugged, and it's his own fault if he's mugged, or a person driving a nice car is at fault if they get carjacked. The fact of the matter is, there's no data. There are no data to support this particular view. Unfortunately, it does seem to persist in our society. The psychopathology explanation says that men who rape are psychologically disturbed or sick. And the same would be true for women who rape or commit sexual assault. Data on convicted rapists, which are very likely skewed results given that these are people who've been convicted. But these data show that generally there is no difference between rapists and other men in terms of psychological well-being. So in other words, even with the most sort of extreme cases where, people's behavior has resulted in arrest and conviction, even those men are no more or less likely to have psychological disturbances compared with men in the general population. So it isn't that people who commit sexual assault are simply psychologically disturbed and, there's something about their mental health that's responsible for this. Another explanation is looks at socialization, and this says that sexual assault exists in our society because our society supports it, and or because it teaches us that it is a normal thing. Due to some aspect of our socialization, many men are implicitly or explicitly taught that forced sex is a viable way to gain sexual release, and that it's a at least relatively, acceptable sexual outlet or sexual technique, I suppose. Um, a large number of studies have demonstrated that sexual coercion and aggression are very, very common. In fact, reviews of the research have reported that anywhere between a third and more than 80% of women report having experienced sexual coercion. Given how incredibly widespread it is, the idea that this is a part of our society certainly does seem to be particularly apt here. Another explanation that looks at our society is called the social disorganization explanation. And according to this, many sociologists believe that crime rates, including sexual assault rates, increase when the social organization of a community is disrupted. That includes things like, when crime rates go up and there's not a lot of convictions. There's not a lot of, say, police presence to actually deter or to deter that crime or to catch criminals. So when that social organization fails to enforce its own norms against crime, enforce its own laws, then according to this perspective, that lack of social organization simply allows more sexual assault to occur. So sometimes this is a pervasive thing in a society. Sometimes it's relegated to certain portions of society, maybe in poor areas where there's less police presence. It can also be a temporary thing, like during times of war or maybe rioting or things like that, where again the organization, the typical societal organization that we all enjoy and that protects all of us, when that thing breaks down, sexual assault tends to become, and other crimes tend to become more common. So there are a variety of theories that have been proposed and used to try to explain and understand sexual violence. Let's take a look right now at what some of the research has shown us. So, in fact, there are a variety of factors that can contribute to the incidence of sexual assault, ranging from forces at the cultural level to forces at the individual level. When it comes to cultural values, for example, depending on what those values are, they may serve to support sexual assault as a viable or acceptable type of behavior. In some societies, for example, studies have shown that sexual assault is more common in cultures characterized by male dominance, a high degree of violence in general, or high degree of acceptance of violence, and an ideology of male toughness. So not surprisingly, all those sort of macho messages and values tend to be associated with violence and with sexual violence. Of course, we've talked already about sexual scripts and how they can influence people's understanding of people, of the world, and of interactions and so on. And those scripts can play a role in sexual aggression. That traditional sex script, for example, says that men are supposed to be oversexed. They are the sexual aggressors. And by adolescence, these scripts tend to get internalized, leading boys and girls, teenagers, to endorse these scripts that justify sexual aggression. Boys just can't help it; they need this or that. Um, and girls are supposed to be on the defensive. Boys are supposed to be trying to score. Girls are supposed to be trying to control whether or not he gets to score. And that whole script is very likely to contribute to sexual aggression. Um, and that can be part of those early family or early social influences. We can also look specifically at influences in the family. So it may be the case that early childhood sexual abuse may actually influence a person to later become, sexually abusive themselves. In fact, research shows that young men who are sexual aggressors are more likely to have been sexually abused themselves in childhood. Now, thankfully, the majority of people who themselves are victims of abuse in childhood do not go on to become perpetrators of abuse in adulthood. But among those who are perpetrators of abuse, they are more likely than average to have been victims of abuse themselves. We can also look in terms of those social influences. We can look at the friend group or the peer group. That can have a powerful influence, particularly if a young man or a boy is surrounded by sexually aggressive, males. In fact, there was one study looking at 1,300 male university students in Canada, and they found that men who had men who had abusive friends or violent, aggressive friends, were more likely to have used sexual aggression themselves. We can also look at characteristics of the immediate situation, not just the bigger picture or sort of the past, the history. We can look specifically more in the moment. So when it comes to characteristics of the situation, we know there are certain things that can play a role that can facilitate or encourage or discourage sexual assault. Um, we know that sexual assault is more likely to occur in secluded places or at parties when there's been a lot of drug use. Another example of a situation would be war, during which sexual assault of women is quite common and rarely punished. We've talked a little bit about miscommunication, and certainly miscommunication between people can be a factor in sexual violence and aggression. A lack of communication can lead people to misread subtle or ambiguous cues. In fact, men are likely to interpret a woman's friendly behavior as carrying aggressive men rather, are likely to interpret a woman's friendly behavior as carrying some sort of sexual message, or as an indicator of sexual attraction to him, when in reality she's just being friendly. Sex and power are very much linked, and we see that they're very much linked when it comes to sexual assault and sexual violence. Feminists have stressed that sexual assault is an expression of power and dominance by men over women. And that is often a theme in feminist theories. It's often a focus, is that power differential that absolutely exists in our society and in the vast majority of them, and certainly in it's something that's simply a part of our culture. Um, so sexual assault sometimes can be attributed to, or can be understood as, the man perceiving a threat to his power or a threat to his dominance, and so he feels the need to assert his power and or his dominance over a woman. And so sexual assault may be an expression of power more than sexual attraction or sexual interest. And of course, we've talked a lot about different social norms, and similar to that traditional sex script, we also have gender norms when it comes to masculinity and femininity, and this idea that men are supposed to be a certain way. Men, to be masculine, you must be assertive, you must be dominant, and no doubt that can contribute to that mentality that can support sexual aggression. So, what we can, take away from this brief review of some of the research findings is that there is, in fact, support for some of these theories, and there is little to no support, for some of these. Um, so, research has not found that women cause their own sexual assault, or victims, male, female, cause their own sexual assault. That victim precipitated, idea holds no weight. It doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. Or the idea that men who commit sexual assault have psychological disorders, that they're psychologically disturbed. Also not the case. The research doesn't support that idea either. What we do see is that socialization, no doubt, plays a role in in instilling those values in people, in men and women, in boys and girls, and we see that when the environment is not able to enforce those norms against violence, well, then we're likely to see greater sexual aggression and sexual violence. So when it comes to the actual perpetrators of sexual assault, there is no typical sexually aggressive man. When it comes to occupation, education, marital status, etc., there's no profile. There's no singular sort of description of sexual aggressors. A large study by Neil Malamuth and colleagues identified four factors that can predispose men to engage in sexual coercion. One of those is a violent home environment. So, in other words, a boy who grows up in a hostile or violent home environment has a greater likelihood of engaging in sexual aggression against women. Um, Delinquency. Delinquency increases the likelihood of engaging in sexual coercion. The boy or the young man associates with delinquent peers who may encourage hostile attitudes, provide rationalizations for committing, illegal acts, and reward a tough, aggressive, macho image. And so there's a lot of reinforcement that can come from having peers who endorse those same values. Um, there's this idea of some men have this sexual predatory orientation. This idea that gaining sex from a partner is like some sort of hunt or competition where he has to overcome some obstacle or defenses, almost like a predator stalking its prey. Um, and some males may depend on, and again, these are aggressive men. Some may depend on sexual conquests to increase their self-esteem and status, for example, within their peer group. And coercion may just be a normal part of these conquests, just another strategy for for winning or for succeeding, dominating, gaining that sexual outcome. Um, we also see that when it comes to sexually aggressive men, there's often this hostile masculine personality that involves this deep-seated hostility toward women. In this mindset, this hostile masculine sort of mindset, masculinity is defined as rejecting anything feminine. So nurturance, caring, sensitivity, etc. Those are feminine and explicitly not masculine, and to be rejected by any male, or at least by these males. And so that masculinity is defined with an emphasis on power and control and those macho, sort of traditional, outdated macho characteristics, not showing not showing emotion, and generally just, I guess, lacking empathy or concern for others. I don't think that's an explicit part of the definition, but it's essentially what it amounts to. Okay, so we know some things about, what can contribute to sexual violence, what can contribute to sexual coercion. And we have some theories that are attempts to bring that information, bring those observations together to help us understand and explain these phenomena. So let's look at another example here. What can we learn, or how can we understand Aziz Ansari? So you may be familiar, this happened just in the past couple of years, that Aziz Ansari was in the news as a result of an encounter he had on a date with a woman where there were two very, very different views, according to, the reports anyway. There were two very different understandings of what was happening in that moment. And so I'm going to show you a quote here um, from Aziz himself about this particular night. So he wrote this after the fact. In September of last year, I met a woman at a party. We went out to dinner, and afterwards we ended up engaging in sexual activity, which by all indications was completely consensual. The next day, I got a text from her saying that although it may have seemed okay, upon further reflection, she felt uncomfortable. It was true that everything did seem okay to me, so when I heard that it was not the case for her, I was surprised and concerned. I took her words to heart and responded privately after taking the time to process what she had said. Now, this was after a night where he was on a date with this woman, and he was trying to have sex with her. She was very much not interested. And she seemed to make it quite clear that she was not interested by, moving away from him when, he was getting too close, by moving his hand away when he was putting it on her, and, just generally just showing a lack of interest. But maybe explicitly she didn't come out and say, no, we're not going to have sex. Um, and he didn't explicitly say, do you want to have sex? Instead, he went about this really boneheaded approach of just trying to say, like, well, come on, you're going to enjoy it or whatever. And kept touching her, kept pressing her, kept pushing, trying to get her to have sex with him. In his mind, this is normal. This is a date. He's trying to express, his desire. And maybe in his head, he thinks she's just reluctant and she'll be happy, or she'll be into it once things are progressing. Maybe in his mind he thinks she's just putting up some sort of token resistance because she doesn't want to appear too easy. Whatever he may have been thinking, it clearly did not match what she was thinking. Her mindset was, this is very uncomfortable, I'm not okay with this, and she's trying her best to stop those activities. Um, so given this scenario, given this event, how can we apply what we know about sexual coercion to try and unpack this, to try and break this down into, well, what exactly was happening there? How can we understand this incident of full-on sexual coercion? Was he aware of what he was doing? Probably not. Based on, everything he said, he seemed to be completely oblivious to her discomfort. So, what about what we know about sexual coercion do you think can help us to understand this particular incident? So far from this being, something about the way she was dressed or the fact that she was willing to go on a date with him. Obviously, that victim precipitated theory doesn't really, well, it doesn't hold water anyway, but certainly doesn't, apply here. He's not a psychopath. He wasn't, acting like a predator, knowingly, trying to sexually assault her. So that leaves us with, well, what can we apply from what we understand about sexual coercion to better understand this situation? Findings about miscommunication certainly seem to be applicable here. Maybe socialization. The guy, instead of saying, I'm really attracted to you, I'm really, enjoying this, do you want to go to the bed? Do you want to have sex? Where do you want to draw the line? What are you comfortable with? Instead, he just tried to kind of use his hands and his mouth to try to send that message. He was just, behaviorally trying to, communicate maybe that he wanted to have sex with her. And she was probably in her behavior trying to communicate to him, no, I don't want to have sex. Um, and so by their actions, each of them was trying to communicate something. And clearly or presumably, he was completely and utterly, oblivious to her discomfort. So certainly it does seem like there's a degree of socialization there. Um, I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that Aziz Ansari is not a sexual predator and probably, because I don't know the guy, probably did not mean to cause her any discomfort. Most likely, this is a result of really bad socialization, really bad sexual education, where his idea of hitting on a woman is putting his hands on her and seeing if she's okay with that. His idea of, trying to initiate sex is basically to put his hand between her legs and wait for her to say, no, that's not okay, or yes, this is okay. Um, and, for her part, she was incredibly uncomfortable in that moment and probably not really sure of how to deal with that. And so, of course, when it comes to situations like this, consent, by far, consent is the crux of this issue here. Consent was not requested or given. Instead, they both went about this sort of body language kind of approach to try to communicate, and it went really poorly. Thankfully, the next day she did feel comfortable pointing out to him, "Hey, that was really not cool. What you did made me really uncomfortable, and it was not okay." And they were. She was able to express that, and hopefully he was able to understand that. It does seem, based on everything he said since, that this is not an example like Louis C.K. knowingly masturbating and knowingly making women uncomfortable and enjoying it. Whether he had a sort of, hostile intention or not, it seems to me that this is a different situation. We have two different examples here of sexual coercion that have probably two very different explanations. Um, Louis was not trying to initiate sex with a partner. Louis C.K. was getting off on masturbating in front of a woman who was really uncomfortable, and for whatever reason, he enjoyed that situation. Aziz was trying to express something to a what he wanted, whom he wanted to be a sexual partner, and went about it so poorly that he probably, I'm not trying to excuse him by any means, but I think he probably inadvertently was doing this and, unknowingly was doing this. Doesn't absolve him of responsibility whatsoever, but it is important to understand it's important to understand where did this come from. And with better education and with better awareness, that type of situation hopefully will become less common and less frequent as people learn to communicate better, as people learn about consent and the importance of consent. In fact, when it comes to preventing sexual assault, uh, consent is a huge, huge part of that message, a huge part of that approach. I posted a video on Owl, just a short, I think it's about 3 minutes, that uses an analogy to discuss consent. And it's a really, really great analogy, and it, I think, is a really impactful way to help people understand this concept. Um, so I suggest that I recommend you take a minute and watch that video now or at the end of this lecture, just to get a sense of one of these efforts that people have made to try and educate people about the importance of sexual consent. Unfortunately, when it comes to prevention of sexual assault, most prevention attempts, historically anyway, have been aimed at women. Obviously, these programs should also address the problems in society that support sexual assault and sexual coercion. Things like socialization of males to be aggressive and hypersexual, socialization of women, of girls and women, to be passive and not to rock the boat or not to cause problems. Attitudes that contribute to sexual assault, things like those misogynistic or outdated sort of macho masculine type attitudes. So when it comes to interventions, well, education certainly has a lot of potential for helping people, to better understand, for example, the importance of consent. Um, so it seems the strongest, intervention strategy would be the one that recognizes and targets these coercive patterns of sexual aggressors that provide programs that provide basic information toward young men and women concerning appropriate forms of sexual conduct, challenging adversarial sexual beliefs and sexual stereotypes, exposing, for example, rape myths for what they are. All of these things are important potential aspects of an education approach to preventing sexual assault. Empathy training has been shown to be an effective tool and is incorporated into a lot of programs aimed at sexual offenders or preventing sexual offenses. Um, if the same type of training were included more broadly in sexual education, then hopefully we would see some decreases in sexual coercion over time. So, based upon findings of social psychologists, it's clear that targeting young people alone for re-education would be insufficient in dealing with these problems. The same message needs to be presented to and accepted by parents, educators, and other people in these young people's lives. As with any other prejudice or stereotypes, this is a fairly daunting task to try to educate all of society. It's one thing to target kids in school. It's another thing to try and send those messages to the people in those kids' lives. But it really is an important aspect of sex education. Um, for example, to revealing to parents that their own children have a likelihood of growing up to be perpetrators or victims of sexual violence, um, could prove to be a powerful message for parents to really get them to recognize the importance of talking to their kids, not just talking to their daughters about avoiding being a victim, but talking especially to their sons about not being, a perpetrator of sexual violence. When it comes to changing those societal attitudes, the people in our environments, a few years ago, about 5 years ago now, the Ontario government invested a huge amount of money into this province-wide campaign to try and address the issue of sexual violence. And so they had this large multimedia campaign, a whole lot of money invested in training support workers, crisis centers, etc. They had this very, very widespread investment in programs to try and change those circumstances on a societal level to reduce the incidence of sexual violence. I don't know if we have any data, or if, how easy or difficult it would be to have data to test a campaign like this, but it certainly does seem to be well guided and based on science and based on what we know about the causes of sexual assault. In addition to a multimedia campaign and training crisis workers and so on, there was also a focus on the judicial system and on laws and things that may serve to support sexual aggression, or that may be used to reduce its incidence. In fact, it's been argued, frankly, for decades, that the extremely low conviction rate for sexual assault serves not only to reduce victims' willingness to report an assault, it also reduces the willingness of police to pursue those charges. If they know that the odds of actually getting a conviction are insanely low, they're going to be far less willing to dedicate all those resources to something that they firmly believe, is not going to actually result in any sort of positive outcome. And so focusing on that judicial system and removing those attitudes, convincing people in the law, for example, law enforcement officers, convincing them of the reality of sexual violence, of how widespread it really is, and training police officers to support victims of violence rather than to, for example, interrogate them. That's a huge, huge change compared to several years ago, where the most likely outcome was that there wouldn't even be charges laid, let alone a conviction. The numbers are still quite low today and quite bad. The conviction rates are quite low. The rates of reporting are quite low. But with time and with changes, those numbers are improving, and we are seeing a greater likelihood of conviction, which should serve to make police more willing to follow up on those allegations and to actually pursue those charges. Unfortunately, until those society-wide changes are really made, and we see those improvements in the legal system and in education and in social values and attitudes, unfortunately, until we get to that point, we still have a pressing need for interventions that target potential victims of sexual violence. Typically, these are focused on women, because the vast majority of victims of sexual violence are female. These strategies tend to fall into two categories. There's avoiding situations in which there's a high risk of sexual assault. That includes things like setting sexual limits, teaching women, girls, or males as well, to be willing to say no to something, in an encounter where you don't want to engage in that behavior. Deciding early if you would like to have sex with the person you're with, and communicating your intentions firmly and clearly. Teaching people not to give mixed messages. If you mean yes, then say yes. And if you mean no, then say no. And if you say something, you should mean it, and don't just, say no because you think you're supposed to. Or say yes because you think you're supposed to. Teaching people to be forceful and firm. If someone is disrespecting you, disrespecting your wishes, politeness is not really relevant. At that point, get impolite, be rude. If you have to put your foot down, if you have to yell, then so be it. If you've been put in that situation, then the last thing you should be concerned about is, oh, what if I offend the person, or I don't want to be rude, or I don't want to embarrass myself if it's not, what I think it is. Speak, what's on your mind, and do so firmly and forcefully if that's what the situation demands. Don't Don't do anything you want to do just to avoid unpleasantness. Be rude, be loud, leave, ask for help. Um, Unfortunately, especially girls and women, but all of us are trained, are socialized and taught to be polite. We're taught not to be rude and offensive, and especially females are taught to be nice, to be polite, and that can be a contributing factor. That socialization, not to be rude is sort of socializing girls and women not to be assertive and not to stand up for yourself. And so, of course, that's an important thing for women and for girls to be taught is be rude, be assertive if that's what the situation demands, and trust your gut. Trust a gut level feeling. If you feel uncomfortable, there's probably a good reason for that. Um, and so when it comes to avoiding those high risk situations, there are a lot of things that are worth teaching people and are worth learning. Um, there's also, when those high risk situations, or when a person finds himself in that situation, if they do find themselves being a victim of some sort of sexual coercion or violence, then knowing self defense techniques can be helpful. A lot of programs aimed at preventing sexual assault include self defense techniques. Um, those can be beneficial, but of course, those are only effective after everything else has failed, and when you're in that absolutely terrible traumatic moment, that's that last resort of, well, if you do find yourself there, there are things you can do. By the way, in case you're curious, eyes, throat, and groin. Those are the three weak points. If you need to hurt someone to protect yourself, don't worry about punching a guy in the throat. Punch him right in the throat if that's what it takes to protect yourself. If you're truly in danger, if you're being victimized, if you're a victim of violence, get violent. Kick him as hard as you can in his balls. Seriously, that'll do it. Forget politeness, drop those inhibitions. If you are being victimized, if you are literally the victim of assault, then assault the person if you can. Don't turn it into a fight. Just do what you have to do to get the hell out of there. Um, don't be polite. Don't worry about hurting the person. If they're trying to hurt you, hurt them. That may be what it takes. No one ever wants to find themselves in that situation. But if you ever do find yourself in that situation, forget all those inhibitions against violence. That is not the time to be nonviolent. That is not the time to be polite or to try to use words. If words have failed and that person is using, physical force, then, violence is absolutely warranted in a situation like that. So eyes, throat, balls, those are the key target areas. I'm not trying to encourage violence, by the way. I don't condone violence. But in a situation like that, absolutely, it's warranted. If it's warranted, then, don't hesitate. Fortunately, today we are far more, as a society, we are far more aware of the reality of sexual violence, and there are far, far more resources available than ever in the past for everyone, males, females, people who have or have not been, victims of sexual violence. There are resources out there to try and prevent and to try to help, and Western has several resources for students, for faculty, for employees. And so I recommend you check out this Western website, safecampus.uwo.ca, and see some of the resources that they provide there. And this is a great example of some of those efforts that need to be made in our society, in our schools, in the workplace. These things need to be in place. Both as a prevention, primarily as prevention, but also to help anyone who has found themselves in a situation that involves sexual aggression or violence, or anyone who has been a victim of sexual violence. So I recommend you check out these resources. There's a lot of valuable stuff in there, and it really does speak to some of those efforts those intervention efforts that people have put in place to try and address this issue. And if you do find that you need help, if you've been a victim of sexual violence, frankly, if you have any mental health concerns or problems, there are a lot of resources available right here on campus, and I really, really strongly recommend that you check them out. Student Health Services has a whole mental health support, element to it, and so there are a lot of valuable resources there. You can meet with counselors, and all of this, I mean, for the most part, these things are covered by OHIP, but also this is covered by your student fees. So if you have a need for support or for help, it is available. It's absolutely available. It's right there, just waiting for you to, to get in touch. Check out those resources. If you need help, that help is there for you, and it can be really beneficial to be able to talk to someone and to get those supports that you may need. So don't hesitate. Therapy is fantastic. Counseling and support, they go a very, very, very long way to helping people deal with ongoing issues in their lives or traumas or whatever it is you may be dealing with. Just being able to talk to someone can really go a long way toward helping people to deal with whatever it is that they're dealing with in their lives. So if you need help, it's right there. Just ask.